Hello and welcome. You are watching Lockdown TV. This is the pop-up news and discussion program from UnHerd.com. During these anxious and difficult lockdown weeks, and possibly months, but hopefully still weeks, we will be pulling together some of the incredible contributors and editors and thinkers who we're lucky enough to have writing for us at UnHerd to try and get a conversation going about what this all means for the future. Clearly, people are doing a lot of big thinking during this strange time, and we want to be part of that and try and bring that together. So I am lucky, first of all, today to be joined for the first time by a co-presenter. This is Eat Your Heart Out, Piers Morgan and Susanna Reid, / Regis and Kelly, or Joe Scarborough and Mika. This is now Freddie and Ed.
Hello.
Ed next to me, hopefully.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Ed, so you're joining us from your shed?
Yes, this is my shed where I've been spending the last few weeks cowering as the plague ravishes us.
So we've got two great guests on today. First of all, we'll be talking to Dominic Frisby, who wrote a great piece for us on UnHerd about homeschooling and the possibilities of remote working, and maybe whether that will be something that we do a lot more of in the future. We'll be talking to him, and also Gavin Haynes, who has another writer who has a great piece on UnHerd this morning, looking into the far right, Steve Bannon and associated thinkers like that, and the strange mysticism that seems to be powering their agenda. But first, Ed, quite a grim sort of day for us to be doing this on, isn't it? It feels quite gloomy.
Yeah. I mean, last night was the news was pretty upsetting. I don't know. I was surprised how upset I felt. I mean, it wasn't just that there's another human being in intensive care, but it felt that the disease has now got so bad that, even the leader of the country, who's quite a fit man, he's not that old, he can be reduced to that. So it was, it's quite upsetting. I thought I woke up, I'm having these anxiety dreams where there are too many people close to me now. I don't know if everyone's having these social distancing anxiety dreams. But I woke up in the middle of the night, and the first thing I checked was whether the Prime Minister had died, and touch wood, he seems to be doing okay. But yeah, it seems like the low point of this whole.
I hope it is. I mean, I you and I have been discussing this a lot in I was about to say in the office, but in our remote office.
We did discuss it back in the office, though.
We did.
Pre-plague era. I remember we.
Yeah, and we sort of represent the opposite poles of pessimism and sort of optimism about this in some way. I mean, my instinct has always been, for some reason, since this happened, to kind of be looking for the better news, and you've been looking for the worse news. But
I can't help it.
This week, I was working on a piece that is still something I'm thinking about, looking at how, in a way, it looks like the tide is turning. Just as this day couldn't seem any more anxious-making, and that this problem couldn't seem any bigger. It looks from the numbers like the tide is turning across Europe. The models in America are being repeatedly revised downwards for how bad they think it's going to be. There's confidence returning to the stock market, which is not especially interesting in itself, but shows that people are looking at those numbers and feeling that there's hope. And so this is at the bottom of the nadir. This is kind of weirdly, hopefully, maybe it can't get any worse than this.
Well, we're about to enter the worst period, I suppose, and we'll. The problem is that it's plateaued in Italy, but the plateau takes a long time. So it's been 3 weeks of, still another 700 deaths a day. Spain is turning the tide, but it's still going to be a long time. And we might be better off than them, but at the projections, I don't see that we're going to be much better in Italy at the way our infection rate is still going up. So it does feel to me that we've got another 6 weeks of real horror before things start to get a little bit better. But at the moment, it seems pretty bleak.
Do Do you think on the question of the Prime Minister, which is obviously the thing most people are thinking about, obviously there's the kind of human aspect that any sensible person or feeling person will be moved by, and hope that he gets better and soon. Do you think it will also have an effect on how cautious the government is about any sort of release from this lockdown? Because there's been a lot more talk about exit strategies and ways that we can bring it to an end. Sort of feels like this has arrested that now, and you'd be a brave person to start talking about plans to get out of lockdown while the Prime Minister's in hospital.
Yeah, I mean, one of the thoughts I did have was that I wanted to look on the bright side, is that this will probably affect people's behaviour in quite a significant way. I mean, we've had all this talk about the nudge units and whatever that works, but there's nothing more, hard a visual image than the leader of the country, who is a fit middle-aged man, and if it can put him in intensive care, I think that will probably change people's behaviour. Maybe that will make them even more cautious about going out. I mean, the main thing is, I've been saying on our in our imaginary office about, I think we may have a harder lockdown like on the continent, but I don't know. I don't see any signs that we're going to all be released from our little jails.
Not anytime soon. Let's take that as a little segue in terms of how to survive in our little jails and in this lockdown, to talk to Dominic. Can we bring Dominic up to the screen?
Hi, gents. How are you doing?
Hi. Thanks for joining us, Dominic.
My pleasure.
And thanks for your piece also. So how's lockdown been for you?
Well, I spend my life in lockdown, hiding in my office, so it's kind of no change really. But I'm Mr. Freelancer, and I do lots of different jobs. And the one job that I do where there's been a huge impact is I work as a comedian, as a stand-up comedian, and comedy basically ended 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago, and there were really good, solid businesses that had been going for 10, 20 years, low margin, not stupid businesses, just established comedy clubs, and they just ended. And all these, there's lots of comedians on the telly, but there's lots of just guys who are jobbing comedians, earn maybe a few £100 a week, live very much hand to mouth, wife and kids to feed, and their income just suddenly stopped. And so the income, the effect of that business, this disease on that business has been, it's just been incredible, and it's been instantaneous. Yeah. And it's pretty, and you look at it and you go, how long is it going to take comedy to recover from this? How willing are people going to be to go to comedy clubs again? And so that's the negative side of it. And then there's also this weird positive side, that suddenly all this creative energy has gone into exploring new ways to deliver comedy, and all sorts of, you probably had this, your WhatsApp has probably not stopped over the last 2 weeks, with people sending you comic videos, and so it's the plus side, if there is a plus side, is it's inspired so much creative experimentation, and perhaps we'll see a new generation of comedians and new forms of comedy emerge as a result. Stand-up comedy itself was born out of it very much in the 1980s. The difficult economics of putting on theatre shows meant that it was much cheaper to just have a person with one microphone, and so it was economic pressures that in a way created stand-up comedy, and maybe this is something similar going on.
There, in another aspect of your lockdown life, was what you wrote about for us, which was teaching or arranging the education of your son. Or this was something that happened in the months leading up to that.
Yeah, well, this is something that happened. It actually happened last year, and just before my son Samuel was due to start at school, in his final year before his A-levels, we had a big falling out with his school, and it turned out his maths department had been rather incompetent, and he was in a bit of trouble at school, and our faith in the competence of his school just had evaporated. And we found ourselves in this situation where it was 2 days before the beginning of term, And my son was saying to me, please don't send me back to that school, Dad. And we and I sort of agreed with him. And I was like, I didn't know what to do. So it was just as a sort of emergency stopgap while we tried to find him another school. I went on this website called tutorhunt.co.uk. And it was like being on Amazon or eBay or something, or TripAdvisor. I just got the best ranked, the tutors with the best star rating in our area, who were also happened to be the cheapest ones, and they came in and they were just teaching him in the interim couple of weeks while I found him a school. And then I was just looking at this and going, actually, this is better than school. And sometimes he would meet them for lessons. Sometimes he'd go and meet them at university, but sometimes they'd do the lessons over Skype. And it was, I was sending my son to a fee-paying school, but it worked out infinitely cheaper than school fees. But if you reverse it and you look at what the government spends per capita on a child in the state education system, what the education that these tutors were delivering was infinitely cheaper and infinitely better because it was one-to-one. And anyway, so I just sort of carried on with it, and he ended up sitting his A-levels, and he did his A-levels, and he got at least a grade better than expected in each of his subjects. And he got a place at Bristol University to read economics, which, if somebody had offered me a place at Bristol University to read economics at the beginning of his education when he was 5 years old, I would have taken that in a flash, so it worked out very well. But the bigger thing to take from this is that the idea of remote education, the Khan Academy and all these online courses, the internet is the most fantastic learning tool ever invented in the history of man. But not just remote education, remote healthcare, remote working, all these things were trends that were already in place. But this COVID virus has just accelerated the adoption of all these new technologies. And I think when it's eventually passed, and let's hope that day is soon, a lot of us are going to look at these new lives that we've been created for us and go, actually, do you know what? This thing worked really well. And this thing worked really well. And so we'll just carry on doing it. And we won't go back to what we were doing before in some cases. So it's really going to change the way, we operate.
Let me bring in Ed. You've also been doing some homeschooling.
Well, yeah. Well, most of it's been my wife at the moment, and I have to say it's been for all of us and for the parents we know, it's quite a struggle. The whole experience. I mean, it's obviously different because we're under a lot of sort of pressure, stress anyway. But I mean, how many people do you think, Dominic, will sort of experience this and think, what, this works out quite well? Because it seems
look, for hard-working families where both parents work, it is a nightmare. And I was sort of overseeing it. I was like the head teacher, if you like. Right. But I actually had tutors delivering the actual teaching. And if I was having to teach, I always dreamt of home educating my kids when I was little, and then just circumstance. Sorry, when they were little, when I was younger.
Yeah.
and it's sort of it's very much a sort of, I think it's quite a sort of libertarian thing. Right. You know better than the education system, and so you want your kids to learn what you think, and rather than if you tend to take the view that the state knows best, then you trust in the state education system. And probably at the end of the day, the best thing is probably a marriage of the two somehow. But right. But anyway, I'm on the libertarian side of things. So I think my instincts were in favor of it anyway. Individual responsibility and all that. So, if you're educating, or you and your wife, Ed, are educating your kids yourself, I can't imagine how difficult that is. I mean, it's just hard. And the reality of schools is a lot of the time it is just childcare, particularly in the early years. It really is.
After 7, it basically is, isn't it? I mean,
yeah, and so, I mean, the Swedes don't even start school, I don't think, till they're 7 or 8, and by the time they're 11, they speak 3 languages. So,
TV.
Sorry.
They learn the languages from the TV, I think.
Maybe. Well, whatever. But it was a flippant comment. So. It is hard, but I bet some families bond as a result of this. They go, actually, do you know what? I rather like it. It's going to be a minority. It's going to be probably less than 10%. It's not like 60% of the country are going to home educate their kids. I imagine, 95% of the country can't wait till schools open again and they can get rid of them. But
they're very popular on the WhatsApp groups. The parents sick of their children memes are big favourites, as you can imagine.
But they are, but they're making light of it and they're making fun of it. But at the same time, there'll be a part of them that, you know, families are getting closer, and it is good for parents to have a part and educate their kids and teach them skills. And it's part of being a parent. So there will be some adoption, but the reality of most people's circumstances and the amount of debt there is in the economy and the need to put food on the table and pay the mortgage and pay the rent and all these things means it's not possible for most people. But there will still be a take up. Go on, Freddie, sorry.
I find like with remote working as well, which was already almost the kind of de facto in technology companies, and a lot of companies, they really push for that. And some people will only take jobs if they're mainly remote working. I've always been a bit of a sort of old stick in the mud about that. I feel there is something quite fundamental about being in the same room as people at the end of the day. You sort of, you know, we live in a physical world, and it's just not the same. I
agree. And a lot of the remote work that I get comes as a result of the fact that I've already worked with a lot of these people in person. So they know I can do the job and they trust me. And
built the relationship,
I've already built the relationship.
Yeah.
When you're starting cold, it's harder, but that's not to say it's impossible. And, you know, the reality is, you know, how long is COVID going to be a part of our lives for? How long is it before we're going to find a vaccine? It could be years. And so it's just, we're going to have these remote video relationships kind of forced on us. But, you know, I've never met you guys before, but I sort of already feel a certain benevolence and fondness and everything else towards you.
I'm feeling that, Dominic, as well.
So of course it's not as good as a real thing, but you know, sometimes you have to make do with whatever there is.
I am getting used to the Zoom drinks. I have to say, I do quite enjoy now. Friday night, Saturday night, a select group of friends sit on the sofa and open the bottle of wine and try to forget what's going on. And you know, you have to get a taxi and just pass out on my sofa while talking. It's great. It's used
Ed, thanks for that. We are going to move on, if that's all right. Dominic, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, folks. Enjoy the lockdown.
It's a pleasure.
Enjoy it yourself. We are going to move on and talk to Gavin. Are you there, Gavin?
Hello. Yes, I'm here.
Thank you. You've been sitting patiently while we've been talking about remote working and Boris Johnson. You have written a great piece that we published this morning about a very different topic, which is Steve Bannon.
Yes.
And what we titled, I hope you thought that was all right, the mysticism of the far right, or the mysticism of Steve Bannon. Will you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess Steve Bannon is the lead character, but he's a bit of an anomaly within that scene. There's something called traditionalism, which is not to be confused with small t traditionalism, which is just moaning about the past. Traditionalism, capital T, is much grander political philosophy, which I guess can be efficiently summarized as the Enlightenment was wrong. And you know, it sits on a political compass somewhere between fascism, capitalism, and communism. Well, capitalism, liberal capitalism, and Steve Bannon, according to Mr. Benjamin Teitelbaum, who wrote this book that I reviewed, which is called The War for Eternity, is a traditionalist. And Steve Bannon, unlike his public image, is a bit of a fruitcake. I mean, he was in the Navy years ago, and he would sort of have to hide his transcendental meditation from his bunkmates because it's not the sort of thing you do in the Navy. And he would visit esoteric bookshops wherever he could and pull down these, 500-page volumes of, deep esoterica. And from that, he has evolved a love of traditionalism. But he sort of blends it with a lot of his other, populist narratives. And I guess one of the conclusions I came to in the piece is that the key thing you can say about him is that he is anti-liberal, and that fits in with both populism and traditionalism, but traditionalism is almost the opposite of populism.
Ed,
Yeah.
are you a traditionalist with a capital T? Can I just ask?
I'm a traditionalist with a small t. I don't know about capital T. I mean, the tradition of a capital T, it sounds like neo-reaction, doesn't it? I mean, from that, is that a similar thing? So basically a belief that, I mean, neo-reaction is a belief that sort of the humans are innately unequal, and so the Enlightenment and the desire for human equality is just a mistake, and therefore some sort of natural aristocracy or even an absolute government, ruler would be in charge. Is that a similar crossover between that?
Yeah, there are a lot of those kinds of threads, but I guess there's a lot more philosophy in there. I mean, we're talking about people like Julius Evola, who was the guy who inspired Mussolini, and a guy called René Guénon, who was a sort of a spiritualist, a mystic. And I guess neo-reactionism is just the idea that, yeah, things were better in the past, and traditionalists are incredibly hierarchical. They believe that men should have dominion over women in their strictest form. I mean, people take different things from it, but overall, they borrow. People like Julius Evola borrowed very specific things from sort of the idea that all religions have a single root, and ultimately the question with traditionalism is it a sort of a pseudo religion with political dimensions, or is it politics with religious dimensions? And it's not quite clear in that sense, but the idea that we're all going through 4 ages of eternity, there's a sort of a cosmic wheel that goes from a priestly age to a warrior age to a sort of a commerce age to what they would all say we are in now, the so-called Kali Yuga, the slave age, where everything is darkness and hierarchy and sort of tradition, capital T, has broken down, is something specific to this creed, sort of neo-mystic creed.
The idea that it then carries on and you go back to the first age.
And there's a lot of fatalism in that. The question for traditionalists is often, do you hasten that event, or do you just sort of wait for it to all cycle out? What is there to do?
So when you reading this book and finding out about this stuff, were there bits of it that you liked, or did you dislike it, or what sort of what's your feeling about it?
I mean, my deepest feeling is that it is sort of bonkers and slightly scary. Another of my feelings is that we tend to view the far right as unthinking, but there is a sort of a corner of the far right that is very much thinking, and is thinking about quite deep things in quite deep ways, and coming up with completely alternative views on everything we see around us. There is something quite seductive in this as a corrective to a lot of the ideas that places like UnHerd wrestle with. Has liberalism failed? What are we all supposed to be doing now? Is there more to man? And traditionalism has a lot to say about that, and it has a lot to say about sort of the incapacity of man sometimes to understand his fellow man. It's taken a lot of people 20 years.
Sorry, one of my children is about to walk in naked. Elfie, what are you doing? All right, thanks very much for that. I don't know why they're all naked.
Work out,
Gavin, because I follow not this weird a section of the internet, but some of them. But I mean, how much of this is done with like layers of irony attached? Because I mean, the two themes that often come up on the sort of online right, some of these very young guys who are very, very clever guys, but firstly, there's a feeling that society is basically decadent and there's no more meaning to it, and there's nothing spiritual to offer. But also, the second thing is that everything's done ironically. So and there's sort of layers of irony, and you don't know whether everything's actually a joke or if people generally believe what they think. I mean, do these people generally? Because some of the stuff is quite wacky, so you wonder, is this just like a pose? Is this just sort of another joke with some other guys online?
I mean, it's not a sort of a Kekistani kind of Pepe kind of meme culture necessarily, but yeah, that those sort of layerings of irony are definitely there for some people. But I think for a lot of people, yeah, you know, a lot of these guys online, they are quite young and smart and loners, and they're trying on these poses and these ideas, but they are seductive. You know, it's all cosplay on the far right to some extent, isn't it? I mean, a lot of this stuff lacks any purchase in the real world. But you know, there's a guy called the Golden One, who is a sort of a far right sort of Swedish YouTuber, and you know, he is a genuine Woden worshipper. And you know, there's two guys called John B. Morgan and Daniel Freiberg, who run the world's largest far-right publishing company, from a Hare Krishna ashram outside Chennai. You know, basically because they're tapped into something deep and spiritual, and that's, you know, society is decadent is not necessarily a slogan to them.
I mean, do you think there's a lot of this stuff we do think about, and it does seem fair to say that the kind of liberal view, the sort of post-Enlightenment, the Enlightenment hangover is still with us, and I guess that's still the sort of dominant way that public life is organised around, and most public intellectuals are kind of would describe themselves in some way like that. Do you think that these kind of characters are almost forced into a sort of more extreme pose because they're kind of fighting against the tide in some way? Like, they wouldn't be able to say, well, of course I, you know, accept some good things about the Enlightenment or the liberal era, but actually I want to just, you know, remind ourselves of some of these other aspects. Do you think they're sort of they become these kind of warriors who say they want to, you know, go to a world before any Enlightenment just to be heard, or just to try and sort of shift the dial in some way?
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard for those sorts of people to actually live and embody traditionalism, because, you know, some of its precepts are just very wacky, and you know, you can't reject toasters as part of the Enlightenment, can you? But I guess, you know, the question is whether you believe it is actually something outside of the sort of three-way face-off between liberalism, communism, and what's the other one, fascism, you know, and that is a bit of an angels dancing on a pinhead question in itself.
Why do you think it's so? Ed said there are a lot of guys. He used the phrase guys, and I'm conscious of that there's three guys having this conversation. Why does it seem to be the guys who are going for this far right philosophy?
I'm saying about 9 very sexist things.
Were there any women in the book you read?
Well, there is a famous woman whose name escapes me right now, but she's very well known. In the 1930s to, I think she died in the 70s, who was a European. I think she was Dutch, and she was a traditionalist, and she wrote a lot about traditionalism, and she went and lived in an ashram in India, like a lot of these people. But overall, no, I mean, it's you know, the far right on the whole is an exceedingly masculine world, but there is a bit of bleed back. You know, people like Brittany Pettibone and Lauren Southern even have been and interviewed Alexander Dugin, who is Putin's pet traditionalist, who sort of believes in this idea of a kind of a greater Russia sphere. So, you know, they're out there.
Ed, do you think all this stuff is? What do you think of it? Is it interesting and worth understanding more? Is it just blankly frightening and kind of atavistic and what's
no,
your?
I mean, I haven't read the book, so I don't know. But I mean, there are these sorts of different philosophies being lumped together. I mean, they often have they are so odds with each other in so many ways, which is one of many reasons why they can never really break out. I mean, I think the really wacky stuff is kind of, it sounds like an interesting thing. And Bannon's a very interesting guy, but I mean, I think that is very uninfluential. I mean, some of the other, some of like neo-reactionary writers like Moldbug probably do have some influence in the wider world on important people, so that's probably more interesting. But a lot of that is done with layers of irony, and it's all a bit of a pose. I mean, and traditionalism, I see it, is in a way sort of the opposite of populism. I mean, that's partly sort of contradiction with Steve Bannon, because he's called populism, but populism is very much very, very, very unlike the traditional far right. It's very defensive, and it's very democratic, and it's responding to change. It's not sort of a vision of grandiose sort of power, and as traditional far right was. So, I mean, I don't know. I didn't read it, but there do seem like there are several different sort of groups there with often very contradictory groups, but ideas. But that's often the same with lots of political philosophies.
What about the US-UK thing? Just as a final question for you, because a lot of this, for some reason, seems to be coming out of America. And I suppose in Europe there are lots of examples. Are either of you familiar with? Is there a far right scene in the UK? Is that something that you've observed?
Like a far right scene or a traditionalist scene, or?
Well, either.
Is there a far right scene in the UK? Yeah, they're out there.
Are there traditionalists with a capital T in the UK, or is this an American phenomenon?
Not that I'm aware of.
Ed?
The tradition thing, I think, is much more is more an American thing. In Europe, it tends to be what people call the far right is generally populists, and they don't tend to be very socially conservative by the standards of traditionalists. They tend to be more, about the ethnic group and defending them, but they're not hugely into sort of old-fashioned, marriage and everything.
I said that was my final question. I've got one more for you, Gavin.
Right.
And then, Ed, I'm going to let you go off to look after Elfie.
There are loads of children now screaming at me.
So, right. You put one point in it which I really resonated, which was that the view on topics like not intervening internationally, they come quite weirdly quite close to Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah.
How's the resonance?
There's a kind of a horseshoe theory thing going on there, because your traditionalist would say that the world, and it sort of almost goes back to Blood and Soil, that sort of very far right sort of fascistic idea. But the traditionalist isn't necessarily racially connoting that term, but like the idea of spheres of influence that come from the sort of ethnography, the deep cultural history of a people and their story. And so someone like Bannon would say that, Russia has rights, has dominions over little bits of eastern Ukraine and the Crimea and the like, because that is part of their historic sphere. And also, there's just a sort of a deeper corrective embedded in traditionalism, which is that, as Guénon put it, there isn't one soul of man, there are many souls of man. And we shouldn't rush to thinking that we understand what other peoples of the world want or should want.
So Western liberalism is a universal idea, ultimately, and the sort of end point of that is that everyone becomes a Western liberal, which is what traditionalists and conservatives of some sorts disagree with. I think, the idea that you invade Iraq and turn Iraq into a European social democracy was the kind of end ridiculous point. This idea that everyone has to become sort of Western, and that's the sort of paradox of Western liberals. They really do want to impose a Western liberal world ideal on the rest of the world. What if those traditionalists would just say, well, yeah, the Russians have their way, the Chinese have their way, the Indians have their way, and let's,
America first.
let them do it, whatever.
Okay, well, we've explored some of that murky corner of the sort of intellectual web and world, hopefully thrown a bit of light on it. Thank you very much for that, Gavin. That was really interesting. Also, Ed, and thank you for tuning in. We will be back tomorrow. Guests uncertain, but we will be there at 4 p.m. This is Lockdown TV, brought to you by UnHerd. Thanks for tuning in.